One of the very successful approaches that has emerged already is about what we call vertical farming. And I'm not necessarily an advocate of that food system, but it has produced successful results. So basically, producing in vertical, in a vertical dimension, so multiply what you do in a greenhouse. So multiple layers of production, and then creating an environment that is fully controlled and often, optimizing the fertilizing and the light that these productions need. Big companies have been designing and producing vertical farming modules, and experimenting around the right or the type of systems that they could use to optimize or minimize use of fertilizers. A big company like Philips has been opening an entire new division in order to design and experiment lighting systems that could help horticultural producers and scaling up vertical farming. So this is one example of type of circular food systems and circular business models that are becoming extremely successful. And another example is around food packaging and so-called smart packaging. So, thinking about packaging as something, as a component of the food product that could be reused, first of all, and secondly, that could carry, useful information for the supply chain layers. So along the supply chain, when different companies have to store or transport the food products, as well as for the final consumers. There is a lot of discussion around food packaging at the moment, both in terms of type of materials to be used in order to make food packaging reusable, as well as making this packaging as a service for food consumers. And many retailers have been co-investing with packaging companies to try to come up with new types of packaging. Before the crisis, there were some other models trying to give even more value to food waste. For example, there is a new sector emerging, particularly in Northwest Europe, of using waste from food production to feed insects. And then using insects, so literally rearing insects at an industrial scale, and then using insects as a source of protein. Insects are very rich in terms of protein, and they're very efficient in transforming any biological matters into high-value matters, particularly protein, as I said. So then insects could be used at least as a feed for fishery, for example, or in poultry production. And this is another example of emerging businesses, business ideas, and if you like, new sectors, which now can accelerate. And if I would be a food producer with a problem of waste, I would look into these ideas. So, why not thinking of small and medium enterprises that have to deal with food waste, creating platforms, cooperatives, or joint venture, whatever legal forms we're thinking of, really, to valorize the waste they have with technologies that we know very well. I remember when I was working in the Netherlands, having various events and meetings with businesses and entrepreneurs particularly, where we were thinking, is innovation basically something you should do as a hobby aside from the core businesses and business activities that you run, or should innovation be always a component, an element of what you do literally every day? And of course, a lot depends on the type of business you are in and the type of persons you are, or organizational culture. But in general, I think, based a little bit on my experience, and not being an entrepreneur or a manager, but having discussed and observed various projects and contexts, if you manage to establish relations with your partners in the supply chain, or even with your competitors sometimes, particularly if you're very, very small, and if you manage to shape that relation with a component around innovation, usually it brings that relation to the next level. It helps to consolidate, to give a stronger foundation to an existing and ongoing. On the other end, honestly, even through failures, and of course we don't like failing, but sometimes even not successful projects have led partners to learn. And I think, many entrepreneurs, one man, one woman type of business, they are all founded on very creative people. And I suppose if you have in portfolio of activities one more innovative activity, it helps you to stay, to stay tuned and exercised around new stuff. So I think having always an innovative component in even very mainstream standardized relation helps both to consolidate those relations and to keep learning and training, particularly your organization or even yourself. We can expect shift in taxation systems, and in more general terms, how public authorities will, engage with problems like waste in general terms, food waste more specifically, or incentivize adoption and diffusion of new business models around, for example, waste, or closing loops of resources, as I said and I described before, vertical farming, insect rearing as a new source of proteins will be key. So in time of crisis, of course, in the first place, you will need to support all businesses and as much as you can. But when resources will need to be channeled towards certain sectors or business propositions that will benefit people and the planet, I suppose the public authorities may want to prefer, facilitate ideas that could combine a better way of using natural resources with with profit making. So in the future, I would expect different systems of taxation, or that could be one element, or definitely incentives for innovating, using sustainable ideas, sustainable for the planet, as well as for people on the planet. So, the environmental and social dimension of innovation. There are various ways of defining local. Of course, the obvious one would be, sort of geographical dimension and the distance. So, measuring, if you like, the distance between the place of production and the place of consumption, and keeping this distance as short as possible. So, there are various approaches to that, saying, a one-day delivery thing could measure the distance between these two places. What matters is the identity. The cultural component could play a big role. So knowing what you are consuming, knowing who produced what you are consuming might be essential. And therefore, whether the producer is placed, 1,000 or more miles away from you might not be so relevant anymore. But definitely, whether you know what has happened to the ingredients you're using or to the food that you are consuming may become more and more relevant. So it goes back to what we discussed previously about the engagement between businesses who are dealing with food and final consumers, new forms of connectivity, of sociality, and creating perhaps food identities online. Of course, for the particular in terms of carbon footprint, I think keeping place of productions and consumptions close, also in geographical terms, would benefit. But I don't think it's the only way of looking at localized food systems.